Hey guys,
We are live, back with
Howdy.
another episode.
we're here. Welcome Jordan to the group.
Thank you. Very
Yes,
glad to be a part of the team and glad to join you on the podcast today.
Yeah, we
yes,
look forward to having you as part of our Security Squad podcast. If I get the name right.
it's good to see the squad growing, and I think it'll be good to have you aboard with some fresh insight, some fresh perspective.
Exactly. So I
Let's
think
get to it.
diving right into a topic today is around a concept that's fresh to us this week, coming off of a podcast, a webinar that we hosted around phishing. And so the concept is external email necessary? At the end of the day, is it something you can just turn off and maybe just have internal email and communications and things like that? So that's kind of the topic we want to talk about for a little bit. Then we can go back and cover some additional topics on top of that.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic worth pursuing. It's going to be a difficult one to implement because so many organizations rely on email, whether they are emailing internally or dealing with customers, dealing with vendors and partners. So it's definitely something that could add to a security profile of an organization. But if it's not implemented properly, it could also lead to business impacts in a negative way. So it's a complex issue.
For
Yeah, it
sure.
definitely could have some operational impact if certain parts of the organization aren't able to communicate when they need to. At the same time, if those present the highest risk, then I guess there is a discussion to be had there as to if it's necessary for them to operate.
Yeah, I mean, from a policy standpoint, you look at how most breaches come in, and a lot of them are through phishing attacks and compromised credentials and things like that that are utilized later on in an attack. So it's definitely a case to be made that maybe not every business unit needs to have email. Maybe there's other ways around it. Whether you use a ticketing system, like for customer service, as an example, maybe all of that can be done through a web portal and not have to do email. I know, like, whenever you email help desk, it usually goes into a ticketing system and it's operated and worked from there. So maybe there's a case not to have it from that perspective.
I know that filtering of external email is definitely something that occurs. So if you wanted to block all non at corporate, at your business domain for certain parts of the organization, that might make more sense, especially ones that might be more targeted and perhaps have a little bit less security hygiene or security practices in place. Parts of the organization that might be more prone to missing the key indicators of a phishing email, that might be more appropriate there. But there are other strategies that you can do other than just blocking the entire outside world or blocking a user from accessing email. You could disable external content from loading. So there, if you have an HTML email that comes into your organization, it's being presented in plain text. A lot of the images and styling and other kind of filler or styling are going to be stripped out of that. And then you're really just left with the content itself. And that
Mhm.
may enable some employees to be able to better identify a legitimate email from a potential phishing email. There's other strategies too. I'm sure that a lot of organizations have considered implementing that banner that goes across the top of your email for external senders. That's something that's definitely a good best practice to have if you have an email provider that you rely on that can implement that kind of thing. Distinguishing uh, on a technical basis, this is coming from outside of the organization, and labeling it when it looks like it's coming from the inside of the organization can really lead to better security hygiene inside of the organization.
Yeah,
True.
that's a great point. I think having a certain group of people with keys to the kingdom, so to speak, to communicate within certain groups, externally could also be another way to go about that. Is having kind of a layer of a human filter, so to speak, and that person can then disseminate or pass along that information internally. It does create a bottleneck operationally, so I'm sure that's why we haven't seen something implemented at scale like that. But what my head goes to when you to some of the suggestions you kind of made, Jordan, was, what about some of those non-technical individuals that kind of communicate readily with externally, like sales? How do we when they see that kind of HTML content, they sometimes don't know how to interpret that. At the same time, they have a high need to communicate externally. So I almost feel you need to take kind of like a triage approach to the different types of sales functions to understand, what degree of openness does each layer of sales need. And, once we've onboarded a client, so to speak, can we just whitelist a certain domain so then external communications can then start to flow, right? But up until then, maybe perhaps not. So,
it would reduce that spam function. I mean, I can't tell you how many spam emails that I get that come in, or unsolicited sales attempts, etc., that come in through email itself. It would definitely slow that down for sure. And I know there's other ways too, from a technology standpoint, like DMARC and SPF records, and turning those on and really enforcing it. A lot of people just do the tilde and just say, well, we're in the process of deploying it. They never really go back and turn on the full enforcement, if you will, of those. And so I think some of those features could help eliminate a lot of this as well too.
Definitely, a hybrid approach, I think, is probably best for almost all organizations. If you take a strictly technological approach to security, there's going to be some human bypass that can be exploited. If you focus strictly on user education, but you don't actually improve the firewalls or the technical filtering that's going on there, then that can be exploited. So I think that a hybrid approach is probably most important. And another thing I want to touch on with this is that phishing attacks and malicious emails are something that every organization is dealing with. There's not a single organization out there that's not dealing with it. And we know this from an individual basis also. So one of the most important things that you can do is educate your employees on what to look for a phishing email. And the things that come to mind for me are, looks like it's coming from somebody that you know or somebody that you should trust. And an indicator you can look for there is, if it seems like it's coming from somebody that I should trust, is there something that stands out that's different than how they normally communicate? Another thing that comes along with a phishing email is a call to action. We're putting stress on you to perform an action, either give me your phone number, send me this document, buy a gift card, all these kinds of things. And the best protection against that is user education and informing them that there's no cultural faux pas against calling up that person and confirming that that's what, is this email legitimate? Should I actually follow the instructions here? And then a third thing is really important, is to enable the employees to be able to report what they think are phishing emails, and then not just be able to report them, but have a team that's actually going to investigate them, and if appropriate, blacklist that sender, blacklist that domain, things like that. And then while those things are touched on often, I think that another area that people miss is not victim blaming. Like I said, every organization is dealing with this. As we've said, not everybody is as educated or aware on these risks and how to distinguish between malicious versus legitimate email. And so there should be some kind of process. Maybe there is some kind of disciplinary action after perhaps an employee that has had multiple attacks successful against them. But I have heard of other less intense mitigations. For example, an employee that clicks on a phishing email, whether it's a test or whether it's a legitimate phishing email, after remediation and mitigation, of course, one thing that might happen is that email doesn't have access to HTML emails anymore. Maybe the rest of the org does, but they might have to regain that kind of privilege. So that's one thing that I've heard from some organizations.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't heard about that approach, but that would be a good way to kind of penalize somebody, not necessarily in a way that would be detrimental to their job, but in a way that makes it a little bit more difficult to do some of what they were doing before, and seeing it as a privilege to use those sensitive systems, right? And then once they kind of understand the responsibility that comes with using those, then they're able to regain those permissions. So that's kind of an interesting approach. But in general, you bring up a really good point in that it's really, I think, as much as disabling or enabling external communications is important, or it could be a potential mitigation strategy. The education part of it's probably the most important part of it, because ultimately, even the users who do have external communication enabled in this environment that we've restricted it, those individuals are not, immune to phishing. They still need to be trained. And so even though you've reduced the attack surface, you haven't eliminated it. So phishing simulations, regular training are still a requirement. So we should see it as a defense in depth kind of approach. Will this necessarily be a silver bullet solution? No, but it could potentially be beneficial as part of the stack. Not to mention, if you have the proper permissions in place per user account, then in a sense, even if they do compromise a user via email, you have other mitigations in place to where they're not able to move laterally in the environment or propagate their compromise further by using, misconfigured permissions to gain access to stuff they shouldn't in the first place. So really, before we're looking at that, it's like if we're going to triage who should and shouldn't be using email, maybe we should triage what are these accounts able to do on the back end if they were to get compromised, right? And there are already a lot of methodologies around kind of best practices around that. So.
Oh yeah, I think that we need to start establishing too, like in your web browser, when there's that green bar across the top, that we know it's an authenticated domain from that perspective. I know domain keys and things like that will show sometimes in the top header of some email clients, but I think having more transparency in those headers could be very beneficial to everyone. So Jordan, I do have a question though. What's your favorite restaurant? So I know when you're requesting that gift card, I won't fall for it.
Yeah, if you hear me calling you or emailing you asking for an Amazon gift card or something like that, it's probably not legitimate.
It's Amazon. That's going to be your hot button. Got it.
Yeah.
Without telling me that you fish people, tell me that you fish people.
Yeah.
Well, in my past life of my previous employer, one of the things that we did was create these phishing and otherwise cybersecurity incident scenarios. And one of the things that is most engaging to the customers, to the users, is these kinds of situations that feel a bit more real world to them. And so there is an opportunity to not only help your employees be more protected against phishing attacks, but also to engage them on security topics in general. We can recognize that there's a lot of fraud attempts and spam out there. What we don't really see are the attempts against vulnerable software or attempts to bypass a firewall, things like that. And so to Sammy, to myself, to you, Brian, that's going to be something that we are very familiar with and are probably interested in. But in order to engage our customers, engage our users, engage our employees on security awareness topics, it's a good intro, a good way to bring them into the table.
He brought up a good point earlier about exposure of some of the headers in emails. I think that's true, because I've had discussions before with internal users about them not being able to identify sometimes very quickly if the domain is malicious or not. Because if you go into Outlook, it's not like the most obvious thing in the world. You have to like double click or click into the name itself by default, right? And then it shows you the domain, but without that, it just shows you the user, which could easily be spoofed.
Right.
Not to mention, it doesn't show you SPF status, if that's pass fail, if DKIM is valid, if DMARC is valid. So it's like these settings are reserved for the technical observer, but maybe if you can expose a few of them to the end user, they can start to learn over time what these things mean. And when they see, SPF fail, just kind of seeing that on its own starts to trigger red flags. And I mean, that's the whole point of like regular simulations. But to Brian's point, I think, showing users what are some of the checks that the spam filters go through, and if they're passing or failing, is an easy way to get them involved with the process of that analysis. And I mean, maybe for some organizations, they simply just want the user to forward that along. But how do you even get to that identification if you don't know what all the indicators are outside of what's displayed to you in the email, which they're constantly working to obfuscate and bypass?
I think that is an important aspect to explore, but it is very challenging because, for one, users are already inundated with messages, whether they are alerts, warnings, pop-ups, and distinguishing from the legitimate ones from the malicious ones is very difficult, especially when if we have a standard, this is a trusted email banner, then that's what they will put in the email. And I received a phishing attempt recently that I shared with the team here, and because of the structure of our Outlook mail system here, there were warnings that were prepended inside of that. But it's easy to overlook if it's inside of the body of the email. And this wasn't an HTML email, it was a text email. So the red banner didn't show up. We do have a problem with, for example, identifying legitimate websites versus malicious websites. Domain names can look very, very similar, and in some cases use characters that look exactly like the real ones. It's a Russian U, and it looks like the English U or something like that. And then we also have the issues of, well, if you look for the lock icon, then it means it's a good website. Well, okay, I can get a certificate and secure my HTTPS phishing site. That doesn't mean that it's trustworthy. In my perspective, it's more important to help users identify the signs of a malicious email than it is to enable them to identify a genuine email, because the genuine emails are what is being spoofed.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a great point. And I'm glad to hear that you're back, Brian. It sounded like you cut off for a minute there.
Got a important phone call, I guess. I don't know. That came in and it cuts me off.
Too busy for us.
Yeah, I don't know if my point got across with what Derek was talking about, so I'll just kind of repeat it. That the little micro trainings are so important to do for users, especially around this topic, so it stays fresh in the mind for phishing and different types of attacks that are evolving and changing. So it's like brushing your teeth, right? You got to do it every day. You can't just do it for 2 hours once a month. It's not going to work. Your teeth will fall out. So
you're telling me that hygiene is not a one-time thing that I can do?
No,
it's health hygiene, cyber hygiene. It's a similar concept. We have to maintain it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's kind of an incremental scrub, right?
It is. So I do think that there's, at the end of the day, at least from my perspective, there's ways to get around external email for some users in your environment, which would help reduce your risk overall, because I don't think everybody needs external email based on the job role or the function. And there's ticketing systems and other ways to navigate around it. Maybe even in finance, you just use the invoicing system. And there's other ways to set those things up to have multi-factor authentication and everything else dialed in so that they're more secure and reduce that threat of business email compromise that we'll talk a little bit more here shortly about. So that's kind of my closing thoughts on this topic. I don't know if you guys have anything else from your perspective.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's a defense in depth approach. I think it could be a very beneficial as part of the stack. I don't think it's a silver bullet solution, but yeah, I think we can certainly look to do so in parts of the organization that we've determined really do not need those external communications. And I think there are more than a few for most orgs. So yeah, I think this is definitely a beneficial control to have.
Wherever possible, restricting the attack surface.
Yep.
It does.
Concur.
Cool. So on that topic, I think Bleeping Computer had an article here that you shared out, Jordan, around the FBI says that business email compromise is a $43 billion scam now. And that's crazy with the increase. I mean, I can totally see this occurring with this whole everybody rush home and go work from home model. And then this whole thing shifting. I mean, you got lots of things that cause urgency, COVID updates, business updates on return to office, or my kid's school has an emergency update type of thing. There's a lot of these things that have been going on. And like it or not, people use their business email sometimes for those things because they want those updates during the day where maybe they're not allowed by policy to access their personal email. So they give the school their work email from that perspective. So it's not, honestly, it's not shocking to see this increase. It's just crazy that we're up to this amount of money, in my opinion.
It's big business.
Yeah.
Organized crime, essentially, is what's going on here. And they've developed systems and processes to exploit areas that they know have a good return. And this is an area that is a low-cost, scalable attack that they can deploy and just kind of, it's along the lines of the Nigerian prince scams. It's something that's easy to deploy, and you just need to get somebody who's unaware enough to follow along and believe you. And really, these are master psychological manipulators. They're people who are very, very good at the craft of getting people to believe them through various means: voicemail, phone, email, text messaging, lots of different ways that they can deploy these attacks. So it doesn't surprise me that it's grown so much, but it is definitely something we have to contend with. It's definitely a sad situation.
Yeah, it's kind of just like a digital form of, con artisanship. It's just essentially they're developing new ways to kind of trigger that emotional trigger in you, to perform an unwanted action under times of usual incognition or stress, and they're masters at figuring out when and where to execute these things. So and then, like you said, low technicality. This is not something that requires years and years of technical experience or networking experience or coding experience or anything like that to perform. There's no zero-day hunting here. You kind of just point and click, and for the most part, you can use public mail servers to relay these things at a massive scale, and just keep burning them and creating new ones. And there's really nothing to prevent it, other than preventing the creation of these things, which is pretty difficult to do. So I think it kind of makes sense why this continues to happen. And then as it kind of relates to vendor email compromise, I think the mixture of the two starts to get really nasty when you start to get legitimate emails that were compromised, or purchased from previous compromises, and those are leveraged to then gain an additional layer of trust, and then actually execute a business email compromise scam. It's pretty innocuous and pretty nasty, the impact.
Yeah, and talking about scaling it and delivering these attacks, the kind of ironic thing is that as the world has moved to cloud, this has actually enabled these types of attacks, because now we have cloud services that are trusted. So if your website is hosted on Azure or Google Cloud or another competitor, if that domain, that host is trusted, then the content is often likely trusted. Spinning up new ones and burning old used ones, like you had mentioned, is easier than ever. And the tools for replicating real websites, real emails, real messages in order to make them look legitimate is more push, point and click than ever.
Yep, you could just clone these things usually, and there's plenty of freeware and commercial software that kind of does this for specific purposes, but can totally be weaponized to create these very, very convincing looking landing pages. Then you throw it on Azure Static Web Apps, and next thing you know, you have a legitimate Azure domain distributing a false, O365 phishing page, and that's going to trick a lot of unsuspecting users that don't have the technical ability to identify what a suspicious phishing email looks like. I think as we are kind of in the trenches, we know what starts to look normal and what doesn't, but the average user doesn't really know when they see a typo squatted domain, and if that's really just another weird way of that a company is distributing that information. They don't know what is considered standard. So to that point, it's a lot easier than ever to deploy these things, and not to mention it's easier than ever to purchase compromised credentials for email accounts on the internet now than ever. So it's a lot easier to perform these attacks from legitimate email accounts. And this was one of our topics last week, was people doing this for the FBI, what was it? The information requests. I think it was like the EAPs or whatnot. But
Oh
anyway,
yeah, getting those credentials to get in there. Yep.
just another
That was
form of
another
it,
thing I
right?
was, yeah, I was going to point out that it's not just small and medium businesses that are affected
EDRs.
by these types of attacks. Governments, very large organizations. I know that Google has been a victim of billing scams where they've received false invoices and some of them have been paid out. I was just reading another article about some threat groups that are suspected to be related with the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and Russia, and that there are potentially attacks against some of the embassies. And if you could compromise an embassy email account and then use that to then further attack relevant organizations, that would be very, very powerful. So you can start to see how these can be not just the purpose of the attack to get in, but really to then get access to then leverage for a further attack too.
Well, imagine that with the embassy to take it a little further. Say you compromise their system, you get their email list, and then you say, everybody meet here at this time to get your visa. And then bam, all gone, right? Like that's, wow, I never thought of that till right now, actually, that these type of things could really escalate to that type of level, if you will.
Yeah, quite easily, I would say. And they can do that.
So one thing I'm
at scale.
curious about is the whole ransomware as a service. Have you guys seen any business email compromise as a service? It sounds like getting the credentials as a service sounds like that's something that's kind of out there already. I'm just curious if you guys have heard or seen any of that so far.
There's definitely like phishing on demand kind of services,
right?
and you can buy access to credentials that have already been compromised, which I think is what you were talking about there. But I'm not sure about beyond that. What do you think, Sammy?
I would imagine so. I mean, when you go browse the markets, you could see that there are. And it's funny you kind of mentioned the ransomware as a service, because I was recently reading a study about how that's actually like not as big of a business model in the world of, that I guess just that side of the world, the dark web world, I should say. That's not as big of a service as you might imagine compared to some other ones. But I can imagine that business email compromise is a part of the suite, because there are just so many other carding and all these other types of services you have there. It's probably a part of the suite of things that are available. It's less technical than some of the other things they're doing. So I can imagine, it would be a service offered. But I also think that because the technicality required to execute one of these things is rather low in comparison, there's probably a lot more, guys from their basement kind of executing these things from across the world than organized crime groups per se. They probably find more value in some other services.
Wait, you have a basement?
That's why the filter's on right now. I can't have you guys seeing you're doing doxing me.
Nice. So I think the last topic here before we wrap is really another one, that hybrid war in Ukraine. That Microsoft had an article posted here about that. I think that's interesting, because one of the policy classes that I recently took, it was before this war started, had stated in international security that there had never been a war escalated out of a cyber attack. And so prior to that, I mean, we do know in 2019 that Ukraine had the power cut off, and a lot of international businesses were impacted by this if they had operations in Ukraine. And so we didn't see it escalate to a war at that time, but it's kind of interesting to see. I know we had some pre-discussions around this topic to see how you guys feel about this topic now.
Yeah, I had to check. It looks like that was back in 2015, but it's definitely clear that the groundwork has been being laid for this invasion for quite some time, and that isn't just the tanks and the fuel trucks and personnel. That's also the cyber infrastructure, and the aggressors here have definitely been testing systems and trying to identify weak spots for quite some time. We can think about the NotPetya attack that spread around the world. That was actually a modification of a ransomware, Petya, and the Petya ransomware was modified to delete its own keys. And so in that case, anything that infected, it was not only locking up, but then throwing away the key so that recovery was not possible except for backups or something like that. And so in that way, even though they were initially targeting a Ukrainian organization, because that organization dealt with international customers, that spread around the world. And so it's interesting to see, like you were saying, that a cyber attack has, at least during the time of your studies, had not escalated into a real world war. But you could make the argument that the reconnaissance and the cyber attacks that have been ongoing in the Ukraine region have led to the or have enabled or been a part of the conflict that we see today.
Yeah, it's definitely a hybrid attack that they come in and go after certain things and try to shut them down. And it's going both ways. I don't believe that it's just one nation going after the other. I think they're both going after each other from the cyber attack space. I don't think that one's just sitting back and letting that occur.
Yeah, I think to your point though, I can't recall like a defining singular event in cybersecurity that had that specific event led to, you know, a declaration of war as a result. I think that's we have yet. I mean, I'm surprised we hadn't, or you know, the Stuxnet thing was probably pretty close, but I don't know. Maybe.
Good point
maybe
there.
I mean, you know what I mean? Maybe in the future we might see something like that, but I don't know if we've seen something like that quite yet. But it's hard to, the lines have kind of blurred a little bit because to Jordan's point, I feel that in modern war, cyber war, they just go hand in hand. It's a part of the reconnaissance. It's a part of the operation.
And before we really had networked technology, it was electronic warfare. And then along with these kinetic and the cyber and the electronic warfare, we also have disinformation campaigns that are going all around. And Russia's not the only one that participates in those kind of campaigns, but they certainly are quite prolific in delivering them. And anytime that there's a conflict, anytime that there's a war or something going on, either side is always trying to present their side as winning, both to their own citizens as well as to the opposition. They want to demoralize the opposition. They want to incentivize or improve the morale of their own teams there. So disinformation is something that definitely gets a part of this. It's, you know, cyber war is not just a cyber thing. It's a hybrid war.
Yeah, man, your point on disinformation, like disinformation as a service. Now that's something interesting and worth talking about. I think because you're seeing that not just at the geopolitical level, but at the commercial level, just between organizations and sometimes just between individual influencers, you will see disinformation campaigns. And we could talk all about Cambridge Analytica here, but I think, you know, seeing that happen at like the geopolitical level is not even just common, but I expected. I think it just kind of stems from the propaganda machine from the 50s and earlier, and this is just a digitized version of that.
Well, let's
different outlets, different media organizations.
Let's think about doing business in that region during a cyber conflict. Like, what does that mean for a software company or a healthcare company? How do you actually continue to interact with that? It's important to have a disaster recovery plan for any kind of incident, whether you have an earthquake, a fire, mass shooting, or anything like that. But then you also have to contend with these cyber attacks too. And if your primary business is not in a technical realm, the software, networking, etc., but your primary business is, for example, delivering healthcare, all of a sudden that becomes massively much more challenging for you to rely on those digital systems. So maybe you have to change your business model, go back to pen and paper. You have to, I don't know, rent carrier pigeons or something.
Right.
Well, you have to start to Chinese firewall off some of your business, if you will. That maybe you have to do different cloud environments or regions for each little segment of the business. Sure, that might make operating costs go up, but maybe for the sake of security and everything else, you have to separate these functions out.
Compartmentalization, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's zero trust at a different level, if you will, but definitely evaluating how to separate those things out overall. I mean, that's another point too. Like, there's a lot of developers in Ukraine and a lot of companies having to figure out how to help get their people out so that they can continue to work. while they're out or still even in nation right now, and help support their people where they can. But like, do you allow them to have all the code on their local machine because the internet's now spotty? I don't know if you want to do that. Maybe that you have to segment some of this stuff off and be prepared for those type of things.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because espionage, industrial espionage, commercial espionage can definitely occur if you get access, not just digital access to their systems, but physical access to their systems. So if somebody evacuates and you pick up the laptop that they left behind, that can be quite revealing. I know that there have been at least a couple of cases of Russian infantry technology, tanks and other communications equipment that have been compromised by the Ukraine and allied forces. And so then, for example, if we're able to disassemble on a technical basis how they're actually performing their communications, that could be something that is kind of akin to the advancements that we had in World War II when we were able to crack the Enigma machine kind of thing. Cryptography is something that's so critical to any battle, any war, to be able to communicate to your troops and your teams without being spied upon there. And if somebody can pick apart the actual hardware that's doing the communication, encryption, decryption, that can be very, very powerful. So that's an advantage for the allies right now, but that's something that this side also needs to contend with.
Great points.
Yeah, very good point.
Well, thank you guys again for another great episode. Jordan, many great insights. Looking forward to having you in this group with us moving forward. Sammy, a pleasure as always.
As always, gentlemen, thank you guys for coming on. Jordan, thank you. This was a good one. We're excited to have you on future ones.
It's been great.
Yep.
I look forward to the next one, and thank you for everybody who's joined into view.
Yep, click that
Excellent.
like and subscribe button down below. All right.
All right.
Take care.
Ciao.
See you guys. All right. Bye-bye.